So I'm Gábor Gyura, I'm head of the Sustainable Finance Department of the Central Bank of Hungary. And I will talk about sustainable finance or the rise of sustainable finance from a regulator's perspective. Obviously, as a central bank, we have a slightly different angle than the previous presentation about the same challenges, the same goals. So let me just share what is happening in Hungary, which is an emerging market. It's part of Central Eastern Europe. We are part of the European Union, and actually we are part of the European Union's sustainable finance framework. But still, Hungary is, as an emerging market, has a less developed financial system, which very much shapes or moves as a regulator. Just as a start, let me just say a few words about how we define the goal of sustainable finance as a regulator. I think we are all familiar with the fact that that these sustainable development goals come with huge investment needs, and clearly, of course, public funds are not sufficient to meet all those financing needs. So we need significant contribution of private funds, be it bank lending or capital markets funding or blended finance. And we need all these private sector players to step up their contribution for green financing. But of course, as a regulator, we always mention here that this should be done with development of ESG risk management, so that climate and environmental risks are taken into account to a larger extent, and the rise of green finance should take place in a very prudent manner. What's the situation in Hungary, where basically we started to give a high priority to green finance almost 3 years ago in 2019. So in Hungary, which is, I said, a small emerging market in Central Europe, as a starting point, we had the perception that the financial system has high exposure to environmental risks, in particular, of course, climate risks, because Hungary is among the more vulnerable countries from a climate perspective in Europe. But we also had the perception, based on surveys and discussion with market players, that basically the financial system has a low preparedness to address these environmental climate risks. There used to be also a very little green financial product supply at that time. So if you just would compare, for instance, situation with the Netherlands, we've seen, I think, great examples from the previous presentation. In Hungary, there was a very little supply of green financial products, and actually a little volume of green funding 3 years ago. And actually also the awareness among senior management was quite low about the importance of climate risks and sustainable finance in general. So not surprisingly, our goal is basically to make improvements in all these fields. So we would like to enable that the financial system is resilient to environmental risks, that it can identify, assess, and manage climate and other environmental related financial risks, and actually that the financial system can act as the catalyst of the green transition of the economy, which is, of course, very necessary everywhere, also in Hungary. And of course, all this requires at the same time awareness and expertise about ESG topics at banks, and also, of course, in the other segments of the financial system. But this is, of course, not an easy task. Let me just mention here a few facts about from our surveys done with Hungarian banks. This is a survey that we did a year ago with all Hungarian banks. The first chart shows that despite the COVID crisis, good news is that the importance of sustainability has even increased some of the banks, but and also there was a considerable share of banks where the importance of sustainability at least didn't lower. But still, I mean, the overall importance of the topic was still not satisfactory. And a second chart is, I think, also quite informative, that still it's a minority of banks in Hungary where senior management is discussing climate risks and environmental topics. This share is, I think, much higher in more advanced markets, such as, for instance, the Netherlands. Again, I think an interesting fact is that there is a capacity or expertise issue. Many banks have reported to us that basically they don't really have the methodology, the expertise to measure climate-related risks. This is a new thing for them, and simply they are not in the position yet to treat these risks in a satisfactory manner. So as an regulator, we had to find out that we need to create more awareness and also help banks to improve capacities for climate and other environmental topics. So that's why early in 2019, the Central Bank of Hungary launched the so-called Green Program, which has basically two main goals. First one is to address climate and environmental risks. I think this is a very traditional role for a regulator as the guardians of financial stability. Secondly, we also would like to help the creation of a supporting environment for green investments in Hungary. So we are very actively trying to help the financial system to provide more green financing to companies and also households. So this program has three pillars. We have many initiatives and policy measures in the financial sector. We also have a lot of activities with domestic stakeholders, with universities, NGOs, with professional organizations, and also internationally. So we also use, for instance, conferences like the one we have today to share experience, also learn from others, from other regulators, other market participants, from NGOs. And we also, of course, participate in many international bodies, such as the Network for Greening the Financial System, which is the global body of central banks committed to fight climate change. And thirdly, this program also has elements about our own operation. So we are committed to decrease our own ecological footprint and would like to act as a role model also in terms of transparency about our own environmental performance. Let me mention a little bit more in detail some of these policy measures. So within our work on climate and environmental risks, we are constantly screening banks' exposures to climate risks, which is basically the analysis of financial data. But at the same time, we are also screening qualitatively the awareness of climate risks. So, for instance, very regularly we do surveys with banks, also discuss these topics with them to see whether the topic has reached a sufficient level of priority among financial institutions. Secondly, just like many central banks, we are developing a climate stress test. So we are trying to model and understand how different climate scenarios could affect the stability of the financial system. We will publish our results next month, hopefully, but I can already tell you that preliminary results tell us that if climate change mitigation measures are successful, that would, and we can reach an orderly transition, so the whole world can be put on a Paris climate agreement aligned scenario. That would be a good news also for financial stability. And in contrast, if the mitigation measures are not successful and basically climate change cannot be mitigated, then that would also be have very unpleasant macroeconomic consequences, and of course also with rising non-performing loan levels. That's what our models are telling us. And thirdly, let me mention here also that we have issued the so-called green recommendation for Hungarian commercial banks, which consists of several elements. Let me just mention the most important ones. So first of all, of course, there are recommendations how banks should improve their environmental and climate-related risk management capacities. Also, there are elements for corporate governance. So, for instance, we would like to see that in every bank there is a responsible owner of climate risks and green finance. Also, in the recommendation, we are calling banks to reduce or even stop the financing of unsustainable activities, and in contrast, start to develop green financial products and solutions. Also, there are elements in the recommendation to improve the transparency of banks about their environmental and climate-related exposures and activities. And finally, also, we recommend to banks to reduce their ecological footprint and also even consider offsetting their carbon footprint. Let me also mention some elements in our program about how we are trying to help banks to provide more green lending. So first of all, as a regulator, we have endorsed the UN's principles for responsible banking. In Hungary, no banks have signed up to these principles until today, but we hope that we can facilitate this, and then banks will also join this very important global initiative. Very importantly, we have introduced also elements in our regulation to incentivize banks to provide more green lending or more favorable green lending. So in our capital requirement framework, we provide discounts for green loans compared to other or even brown loans. I will talk about that later a bit. And also in cooperation with EBRD, we are developing a sustainable capital market strategy for Hungary. I've mentioned that we are providing some capital requirement discounts for banks. For those of you who are not very informed about bank regulation, capital requirements are, of course, probably the most important element of bank regulation. These requirements stipulate how much capital banks have to hold for certain loan or other assets on their balance sheet. And the idea in our program is that if banks buy green bonds or provide loans to renewable energy production, or if they finance sustainable agricultural activities, then they can lower the capital hold for these activities, which we hope, and this is also already happening, is encouraging, of course, banks through the cost of equity to provide more green lending. Let me just also say a few words about capital markets in Hungary. There is a big, I think, waves about ESG in capital markets, and there is a big rise of ESG mutual funds in many markets globally. In Hungary, also ESG is becoming more important, but still the ratio of ESG funds is still very, very small. It's like even lower than 1%, but we are working hard to improve this. That's why it's important that we will be developing a capital market strategy, sustainable capital market strategy, which will hopefully help asset managers to provide and offer more ESG or even impact related mutual funds. On the green bond market, we see in Hungary very favorable signs. Just a couple of years ago in Hungary, there were no green bonds, but this has changed. And last year we've seen, and also this year, many green bond issuances. So I think this is a nice number. In 2020, basically in the flows, more than 10% of green bond issuances in the corporate sector were green already. And like I said, this KPI was 0 just 2 years ago. And finally, let me mention also here carbon neutrality. As a central bank, we think that of course, credibility is extremely important. So that's why we are cooperating with WWF Hungary, and we are very aggressively reducing our own carbon footprint. But of course, there is always a remaining carbon footprint for any organization, and this is offset in local natural projects in cooperation with WWF. So this means that we will be operating in a carbon neutral manner through these programs. And my final slide is about the importance of education and research. I think ESG and sustainable finance is very knowledge intensive. And like I mentioned, in many banks and financial enterprises, there is a lack of knowledge about environmental issues. And that's why we are cooperating with universities and also professional training organizations, so that Hungarian bankers and asset managers and insurance companies have basically a pool of experts. So basically all economic university students who come out of university should have some expertise, and that's probably a very important structural condition for the further development of the green finance market in Hungary. So that brings me to the ending of my presentation. Thank you for your attention.